Good morning and good afternoon to all our participants and to our speakers who are with us here today. Welcome to this second to last session of the Stockholm Security Conference 2020, where we will discuss together the growing trend of techno-nationalism and its implications for international cooperation. Techno-nationalism stems from the connection made between states' innovation capabilities and national security. From this perspective, technological innovation, in particular in the digital sector, is seen as a means to advance states' power on the international stage. This generates the perceived need to protect the country's own scientific knowledge and manufacturing capacity, and that to hinder other states in their own innovation capabilities. Keeping the lead in technological innovation, which also sustains military dominance, has thus become one of the major fields of global competition. However, the capacity to innovate and produce advanced technologies relies on international scientific cooperation, the movement of people and ideas, and international supply chains. There thus seems to be an inherent contradiction between techno-nationalism and the protectionism it entails, and the will to remain ahead of the technological race. This concept of techno-nationalism is evolving, capturing even more rapidly evolving trends in today's economy and international security landscape. So I hope that this session will help us clarify these notions, identify the key trends we should look at today, and what to be aware of for tomorrow, in particular in the post-COVID-19 world that we are entering. So I will be chairing this session with three distinguished speakers who will address these topics for us. We will have here with us Dr. Seema Gehlot, Senior Fellow with the Trade, Technology and Security Program at the Stimson Center. Her area of expertise include the legal and institutional design of strategic trade control and management systems, international compliance programs, the implementation of the UN Security Council Resolution 1540, CBRN security and security culture. Seema has over 15 years of experience in conducting and managing training programs on strategic trade control for governments and industry. At the Stimson Center, she contributes to the Strategic Trade Management Initiative, which facilitates efforts by national governments to regulate foreign and domestic trade in dual-use technologies. Seema recently published remarks for the International Affairs Forum on the COVID-19 pandemic's squeeze on international trade. She will be followed by Dr. Andreas Kuhn, a Senior Program Associate at the East-West Institute. As part of the East-West Institute's Global Cooperation in Cyberspace program, Andreas is responsible for the development of breakthrough groups on the Internet of Things and encryption policy. His expertise focuses on emerging information technology issues at the intersection of cybersecurity, digital policy, and internet governance. Before joining the East-West Institute, Andreas conducted research at Stanford University's Center for International Security and Cooperation, was an adjunct researcher at the RAND Corporation, and worked in various public and private sector positions. His latest analysis on techno-nationalism, cybersecurity, and geopolitics is available on the East-West Institute website. And our third speaker today is Mrs. Rui Zhong, a program associate for the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States at the Wilson Center. She manages Mapping China's Cultural Genome, a project that collects top-level speeches and commentary on China's global cultural ambitions. Her research interests include China's role in the East Asian political economy and how nationalist interests can impact business, technology, and cultural policies. Rui's writing has appeared in Foreign Policy, The Washington Post, China File, and more. Her latest analysis includes an article discussing WeChat and TikTok businesses in the US for the MIT Technology Review. So without further ado, I will now leave the floor to Seema, who will be followed by Andreas and then Rui. Each of our panelists today will speak for about 15 minutes, after which we will open the floor for discussion, thanks to the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Seema, over to you now. You're still muted, sorry.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. And thank you to CIPRI and the team behind Stockholm Security Conference for inviting me. In various ways, my work on export controls, sanctions, FDI screening has been propelling me towards the bigger picture implications of growing restrictions. So when I sat down to look at the guiding questions that Lucy had helpfully provided, I really did a deep dive into the trajectory and quantum of restrictive measures that broadly come under techno-nationalism. I am privileged to have worked with about 60 countries on issues of strategic trade controls. So I have been aware of the questions and concerns regarding technology controls in general and sanctions in particular. So my remarks today may be somewhat colored by a non-Western centric view of the topic. Next, please. So generally speaking, adherence to the concept of economic nationalism say that it promotes domestic industry, investment into citizens instead of multinational corporations or foreign trade interests. Our concern here is that protectionist policies for domestic economy overlook things like comparative advantage. However, in many ways, economic nationalism is also a reaction to governance by international organizations, the enormous power of global corporations, and the transnational lobbies for certain policies. All of these forces are seen as ignoring the interests of the local citizens, small and medium enterprises, school districts, and city or county governments. But this is not a new phenomenon. We've had this issue of hyper-local or national controls over certain assets, and it's been an established policy in many parts of the world. There are reservations, quotas, conditions favoring locals or nationals in employment. We have restrictive immigration policies. We have increasingly data protection regulations, the EU's own GDPR or China's cybersecurity law of 2017, which requires that personal information and other important data has to be stored locally within China. Again, technology as power is also not new. Some of you might recall that this is a long-held view of non-aligned movement regarding export controls. They have long-held suspicions that multilateral export control regimes are a way to deny technology to developing countries. But I believe that the goal of current technology policies is not technology dominance anymore. It's just focused on maintaining the critical edge. In an environment where diffusion of military technologies into civilian market is a business imperative. You can only get higher profits through mass applications. This is the best that can be achieved. So I'm not overstating the issue of technology dominance as the goal. On protectionism, tariff subsidies, quotas on non-technology items have already been there long before COVID, but they haven't been as rampant. Some would say EU common agricultural policies, subsidies to rice growers in Japan, and wheat farmers in the US, all are in the same, cut from the same cloth. The new thing this time is the discussion of subsidies and protections for technology companies, such as efforts to stand up Nokia and Ericsson in the 5G space. The other new thing is the use of sanctions, ostensibly for human rights issues, Hikvision, for instance. But the connection with the retaliation and technology protectionism is really hard to miss in this case. Next, please. So the post-COVID vision in general is to have a balance between efficiency and stability in both industrial chains and supply chains. Just-in-time delivery or stocking practices have shown their limits. So now safety stocks have become fashionable again, despite their inefficiencies. According to experts, however, China's deep supplier networks, its flexible and able workforce, and its large and efficient ports and transportation infrastructure took more than 20 years to build. Replicating it or cutting away from this, especially in democratic countries, will be really difficult. So the business view is that it might require corporatism of the kind Scandinavian countries pioneered in the 80s and 90s to do this. So some existing global chains, I believe, will continue to be nurtured. On the other hand, a lot of people are seeing potential in emerging technologies within supply chains. So we're talking about additive manufacturing, automation, continuous flow manufacturing, or flexible manufacturing platforms. These would, it's believed, will allow the development of regional sourcing hubs. So now you have, suppliers to markets close to them. Latin America as a base for supplies to North America, Eastern Europe and Turkey and Ukraine for supplies to Europe, and South and Southeast Asia to supplies to East Asia and maybe Africa. And each of these regional hubs would need to develop differentiation in components that can be assembled into a product within the region. This is how the supply chains are being looked at. And what we are looking at really is an aspiration for selective self-sufficiency. So nobody's thinking in terms of islands of self-sufficiency, but really limited self-sufficiency to reduce dependence. Next, please. So where in this kind of a busy slide, what I'm trying to explain why this pivot to techno-nationalism. So the techno-nationalism links technology, innovation, and capabilities directly to national security, economic prosperity, and social stability. So the state is therefore required to intervene and guard against both state and non-state actors who are hostile or at least have malicious intent. But the current wave of techno-nationalism appears to be based on this disillusionment of the liberal idea, which is that access to Western economic system will change the technology governance and business practices of authoritarian countries. For instance, the concern that China's adaptation to operate in free markets, that is state-guided capitalism, is an unforeseen development and gives it unfair advantage. And you'll see a lot of literature on this. There's also an ideological challenge here. China has shown that centrally planned markets do not always create market distortions, and that they can help leapfrog generations of technological development when state and industry work together. One example being used, which is often cited, is the use of state resources to help state-owned enterprises, as well as so-called private companies, underbid their competitors. So we're talking about Huawei, Beidou, Tencent, Hikvision as examples. The sheer weight of these companies in these sectors, in their own sectors, is now being brought to bear on shaping industry standards in next generation technologies, including 5G. That's why, for instance, the EU has stressed that there is a need to join forces to counter efforts by China's state-backed companies to influence the International Telecommunication Union and International Organization for Standardization. So there are a number of policies in China that focus on the acquisition of technology from companies in the West and some countries in the East. And they're using gaps in intellectual property regimes, intangible technology transfers, foreign direct investment, and foreign portfolio investment. So you may have heard of examples like, they've acquired experts and engineers from Taiwan. There's a case of two companies in China, QXIC and HSMC, who've used attractive financial incentives paid for with state subsidies to hire 100 engineers away from Taiwan's TSMC, the world's largest contract chip maker. And so, to some, this appears to be similar to Iraqi, North Korean, and Iranian efforts to recruit Soviet scientists when the Soviet Union broke up. So it's not just a loss of expertise, but the concern that this talent pool might well be used against the original country's economic as well as security initiatives. So intangible technology transfer controls have come up as a response. The belief is that technical experts are the real repositories of technical knowledge, and they need to be monitored, and their involvement in foreign or foreign-owned programs and projects needs to be regulated. Universities, therefore, have become the target of this kind of due diligence. There's the understanding that China's military-civil fusion policy, which is harvesting technology from foreign academic and R&D institutions via Chinese students, researchers, and even PLA officials engaged in exchange programs and joint research projects. Next, please. So where does this techno-nationalism show? Russian actions of concern in this case, is limited to misuse of technology, social media, and sales of technology to Iran. But in the case of China, the concern is very wide-ranging, and the responses have been focused on monitoring and decoupling wherever possible and where necessary to programs and projects linked with China. For instance, the BRI investments now total 117 billion since 2013. But several recipients of BRI have faced acute balance of payments and debt problems. There is a perceived loss of sovereignty over territory and foreign defense policy. So those watching these developments have tried to follow the US model and created FDI screening requirements, which may be worded generally, but practically focus on Chinese investments, in some cases Russian involvement. So now the reassessment of particular supply chains is inevitable. In general, companies are already asking questions like how flexible is your manufacturing capacity? Can it be reconfigured, redeployed? Or whether it consists of highly specialized and difficult to replicate operations. In the difficult to replicate operations of the manufacturing chain, regardless of technical nationalist concerns, I expect that China's unique capacity to supply crucial ingredients will ensure that the link will remain unbroken. This, of course, does not preclude state-centric measures in other countries to develop alternatives to dependence on China. The most obvious example, of course, is rare earths and the refining of neodymium for the magnets in AirPods and electric vehicle motors. So only China has the capability. But again, Japan, US, and India are exploring alternatives to this. There's also this strategy being explored, which is called China Plus One, which is that supply chains include China, but one more country in Southeast Asia. However, some Chinese companies have already started operations in these target countries in Southeast Asia to avail of this new non-China thrust. Chinese firms that want to protect their global market share are already looking to Egypt, Ethiopia, Kenya, Myanmar, and Sri Lanka for low-tech, labor-intensive productions. China itself is seeking to reduce its dependence on global markets for its products. President Xi talked about dual circulation strategies, which is to target a substantial part of Chinese production back into domestic market. The reasoning is that, if according to the predictions in September 2020, China's per capita gross domestic product will reach $14,000 by 2024, and Chinese market will be bigger than that of the United States by 2025. There will be at least 560 million middle-income consumers in China who will avail of Chinese products. On the other hand, some people have concerns or they disbelieve this because Premier Li Keqiang said at a press conference in August 2020 that 600 million of China's 1.4 billion residents live on a monthly income of only 1,000 yuan, which is $146. So how well this strategy, dual circulation strategy will work is up for debate in this case. Next, please. So really the future of international cooperation. There are some questions that still need to be answered. The main one being, is market dominance more important than military dominance? The link in techno-nationalism between these two has not been fully explored. So the questions that we are asking is, which technologies need to be guarded as national treasures? And how can we separate national security concerns from competitiveness concerns? These questions are behind the struggle to define the list of emerging technologies in the US, for instance, those that will require enhanced due diligence if foreign nationals are involved. So there is another attempt, a separate attempt to define the issue as global public goods. Things that are too crucial for the international community to be barricaded at national or even regional levels, and where the international cooperation is a must and will continue. You'll see the examples here. We're talking about things that have to do with public health, really, vaccine, PPE production, disease surveillance. The question, however, remains about multilateral institutions for things that we consider global public goods: health, climate change, diplomatic dialogue, and financial markets. And then the second order, proliferation prevention, arms control, and disarmament-related institutions. What's going to happen to them if the cooperation that we hope or we have been used to breaks down? So in my broad view, techno-nationalism is not about breakdown in international cooperation, international being the underlying word per se, but reduced cooperation with some countries. So the message seems to be, you have to pick your friends, include them in your innovation and supply chains, and you have to pick who are your rivals and enemies, and you have to exclude them from there. So it's not a total breakdown in international cooperation, but you are seeing blocks forming already. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think I already have many questions to ask you following this interesting presentation and also thought-provoking conclusion. But first, let's hear our other panelists, starting with Andreas, please.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. I'm just getting started with my slides. Give me one quick second here, please. Hello, everyone. My name is Andreas Kuhn. I'm a senior program associate with the East-West Institute, and thank you for organizing and inviting me to this excellent panel. Seema, I really enjoyed your very broad initial remarks, very insightful. My remarks today are largely based on the Weathering Technationalism report, which is available at www.eastwest.ngo/technationalism, and will be structured in 3 parts. First, an overview of ICT supply chains and cybersecurity. Second, risk management as an approach to mitigate against unintended consequences of technationalism. And third, cooperation in the context of techno-nationalism. As states recognize the strategic nature of ICT for security and the economy, concerns about their reliance on foreign suppliers for this critical technology is growing. As a result, states all around the globe have enacted or are considering restrictive measures with the goal of enhancing cyber and supply chain security. We named this development technology nationalism, which we define as government policies or actions that directly or indirectly favor ICT products and services sold by companies headquartered domestically or in allied states over those headquartered in states seen as competitors or adversaries. Examples of such restrictive measures include actions such as requiring companies to localize data. Seema already talked about this, giving preferences to domestic products, subjecting foreign companies to enhanced security requirements, for example, mandatory source code inspection, requiring companies to partner with domestic entities or adhere to ownership limitations to gain market access, as well as banning specific foreign products or vendors. At the center of the controversy about national security concerns are emerging technologies such as 5G, semiconductors, cloud computing or IoT, but also apps as well as bulk power energy equipment. And the suppliers here are well-known companies such as the Chinese telecommunication equipment manufacturer Huawei or CTE, or Russian cybersecurity firm Kaspersky. Against this backdrop, I want to briefly talk about why securing ICT and supply chains is difficult. First, supply chains are complex and difficult to secure due to their distributed and global nature. Apple, for instance, has more than 200 suppliers in 43 countries on 6 continents, each with their own supply chains and multiple subcontractors. Second, cybersecurity is hard and remains a foundational problem. Even ICT developed by trusted entities contain unintentional exploitable security flaws. Frequent software updates to keep us all secure make only exacerbate this kind of difficult ICT security challenge. And third, Seema also already talked about this, ICT is a strategic asset for economic prosperity and military power, thus putting technology at the core of geopolitical tensions. And finally, accountability for bad behavior in supply chain is limited, as malicious actors are difficult to deter or hold accountable. Oops, let me go back here. So no doubt, there are legitimate national security concerns that may warrant strict measures. However, competing interests may require difficult trade-offs between security and economic interests. Technationalism has the potential to undermine national goals in negative, unintended ways. Exclusion of a technology or vendor might lower competition based on security concerns, lead to less secure technology options for buyers, which is bad for cybersecurity, and lower overall innovation and competitiveness. Such measures may leave us with a false sense of security and safety. Let me try this to illustrate on 2 what I call popular view. First view is technationalism is better for security. It has been argued that banning foreign ICT makes a country more secure. However, foreign ICT is not necessarily less secure, nor is domestic ICT proven to be less vulnerable. In fact, competition helps raise the bar for security requirements in the industry. ultimately, a capable adversary will hardly discriminate between domestic or foreign security flaws, but exploit whatever is in reach. Popular view number 2 is tech nationalism is better for the economy. The current crisis has amplified the call to repatriate parts of the global supply chain to create secure domestic industries and strengthen national manufacturing and create domestic jobs to jumpstart the economy. Again, while control over domestic supply chains can be attractive in certain situations, the economic cost of such policies may quickly outrun the benefits. The Weathering Tech Nationalism report that I was referring to before proposed an alternative approach to address security concerns based on risk assessment while getting help from government to address long-term risk and competitiveness. The report's framework aims at ensuring ICT security and trustworthiness through risk-informed, objective, quantifiable measures to foster assurance, transparency, and accountability. The idea is that a single measure does not create sufficient security or trustworthiness, but in combination, they can bring us to a higher level of confidence and reduce residual risk to an acceptable level. Trust must be earned, and trust is achieved through ongoing verification through secure measures. The framework consists of 5 components, which I summarize for the benefit of brevity. On your left side, the first component looks at what ICT buyers can do in terms of risk-informed procurement requirements. This includes requiring vendors to follow international standards for secure code development, to ensure that services and software are delivered in a default secure configuration, and that best practices for cybersecurity are used, such as for vulnerability management. In the middle, you see the second and third component, which address requirements at the industry level for buyers and vendors. ICT buyers, using their collective purchasing power, should establish best practices that require vendors to provide statements of supply chain risk management. But also, industry can build up consortiums for ICT security assessment. On the other side, the vendors should push for vendor-led assurance and transparency requirements, including their cooperation in international standard setting on those issues. Furthermore, vendors should adopt technology-specific evaluation and accreditation schemes and establishing industry-wide oversight board on specific cybersecurity matters. Finally, on the right side, the fifth and fourth component address the broader industry ecosystem. As with regional transparency centers that allow code review and testing, as well as global conformance programs, such as efforts that are currently underway in the European Union. The report further recognizes that security is a shared responsibility among vendors, operators, and buyers. A secure device deployed with a faulty configuration exposes the security and privacy of the user. Thus, joint efforts and coordination are needed to ensure security and resilience throughout the ICT lifecycle. Of course, governments also have a role to play in this, particularly in areas where organizations and industry are ill-equipped to do so. Along this line of reasoning, governments should promote threat and vulnerability information sharing along the supply chain, adopt multiple sourcing requirements for ICT in critical infrastructure sectors, and make also strategic investments in science and technology to reduce foreign tech dependence. So now let me come to the third and final segment of my remarks and tie back my earlier thoughts in this session to international cooperation. It is my view that supply chain security for the ICT sector, but also for the economy overall, will remain a hot policy topic in the years to come, and will increase in importance as the world will figure out what policy measures are acceptable and effective to address national security and cybersecurity concerns, while also balancing competing trade, commerce, and innovation interests. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown how important global supply chains, secure ICT, and scientific collaboration are to withstand the crisis. Calls for the decoupling of technological and economic universes and the on or on or reshoring of all kinds of manufacturing, such as the domestic production of medical, pharmaceuticals, and surgical products, for instance, may sound good, but are costly, difficult to manage, and their outcomes uncertain. Simplistic measures are likely to be short-lived and provide a false sense of security and safety. To think about cooperation in a new area of techno-nationalism, we need to take the following into account. First, sorry for the interruption here. To think about the cooperation in the new area of techno-nationalism, we need to take the following into account. First, how technology is invented, produced, distributed, and used has changed significantly in the past decades. While in the past, critical technologies such as the global positioning system, GPS, or the internet were invented by the US military and then were made available for civilian use, today the model has changed and critical inventions are made in the private sector for commercial use, from which the military is procuring solutions. This shift in the invention and commercialization of the dual-use ICT technologies has significant implications for how a technology or the knowledge thereof can be controlled. Second, each technology in the industry is unique and requires a separate assessment for their potential cooperation. Third, technological capabilities and capacities will further determine a country's interest in S&T or R&D cooperation. The need and type of cooperation for the US or China as major powers are different from small innovative economies such as the Netherlands or Switzerland, or countries in the global south. Of course, weeks after the US election, policy wonks are pondering what the change in the US administration will bring for US-China relations, which could have significant implications for cooperation. The jury is still out on that. Personally, I don't expect major departures from current policies in the short term. The push for closer cooperation among like-minded states will continue and likely gain momentum. This includes the discourse within the European Union about digital sovereignty to ensure Europe's ability to act independently in a global digital environment. GDPR and the Gaia-X project, the future federated data infrastructure for Europe, are examples of that. But also transatlantic efforts that emphasize shared values, interests, and are rooted in liberal democracies will further thrive to foster cooperation through technology alliances to promote multilateral technology policy coordination and joint research efforts among like-minded nations to defend against authoritarian regimes and secure global stability and economic prosperity. At the international normative level, more cooperation is needed to drive forward the implementation of principles and norms for responsible behavior in cyberspace, as it relates to ICT supply chain security. Norm developing initiatives such as the UNGGE has proposed Norm I in the 2015 consensus reports that states should take responsible steps to ensure the integrity of the supply chain so that end users can have confidence in the security of ICT products. Similarly, the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace came out with a norm that states state and non-state actors should not tamper with products and services in the development and production, nor allow them to tamper with, if doing so may substantially impair the stability of cyberspace. To look at the question of cooperation in specific S&T fields, I can recommend looking at the report Meeting the China Challenge, a new America strategy for technology competition that was released this week. In light of US global science and technology leadership and China's rapid advances, the report provides specific recommendations on fundamental research, 5G, artificial intelligence, and biotechnology. Coming to an end, let me make a full circle and end on a note on cybersecurity. Cooperation is critical for cybersecurity. Current techno-nationalistic tendencies add further obstacles to an already difficult problem that is global cybersecurity cooperation. Global cooperation, including with China and Russia, are important to be able to swiftly respond to cyber incidents or coordinate law enforcement activities to investigate cybercrime. To add a final illustration to the challenge, the Forum of Incident Response and Security Teams, short FIRST, had to suspend several members in good standing in response to export control restrictions, leaving users of Chinese devices at risk of cyber exploitations without the ability to receive critical information to fix software vulnerabilities. With this point, I'd like to end and look forward to discussion, and handing back to you, Lucy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andreas. So I see there's already some common features between you and Sima, and you both seem to say that there might be some sort of like rival coalitions or groups of like-minded states that might face each other, but there are some areas for international cooperation. So I guess it's a sort of like optimistic side of things. But I think one question I will have for later is like, to what extent, if relationships are so difficult in one area, how much that will hamper cooperation in those other areas, which could be good places to work together. But before this, I'll leave the floor now to Shui. Over to you.
Thank you so much. And this has been a wonderful conversation to be a part of this morning virtually. So I'd like to try to keep my remarks short so we can discuss and take questions, but I am going to be speaking this morning about the US-China relationship and how its changes in recent years have impacted the way that technology companies operate, the way that they are planning for the future, and some of the challenges for both technology companies and also users in the US-China relationship are going to be facing in the future with regards to decoupling, but also the challenges of the forthcoming competitive era between China and the United States. So just to kick off the way that we're thinking about the US-China tech relationship, I want to turn your attention to the TikTok and WeChat bans. This is not the first time that the United States government has scrutinized the operations of Chinese technology companies within the United States. ZTE and Huawei in the past have been flagged as concerns, albeit for hardware infrastructures and telecommunications infrastructure. However, the way that the government has approached the companies have been sort of a vanguard of how these issues are going to be addressed. And China's definition of security, and cybersecurity in particular, has been very sort of broad and general, and it's encompassed both what we would traditionally think of as cybersecurity, aka, are our networks safe from being exploited? But China's definition of security has also been broadened to include political security. That is, do our technology infrastructures, do our tech corporations, and everything supporting our tech system, does it help support the political security of the CCP and, by extension, the current leader of the CCP, Xi Jinping? So as these corporations are expanding their product offerings and increasing influence within the global supply chain, this is something that you're starting to see flagged as a concern, not just by the United States, but also Australia, the EU, and other members of the supply chain that China is participating in. And so as of right now, within the United States, we're starting to see certain benchmarks of a decoupling process. So what do I mean by a decoupling process? It means in the medium to longer term, the supply chain plans of the United States corporations and potentially the trading practices of its partners might change R&D and talent flow within the medium to long term is also really subject to change, not only because of security concerns, but also because of our current state in the COVID-19 pandemic and the changing education environment. And so as time goes on, the technological environment is going to incentivize universities, research institutes, and corporations to change their behavior. Lastly, there is the sort of cultural dimension of a decoupling process. We have a increasingly challenging political and immigration climate, and that has been a key factor in dropping enrollment rates in US universities for STEM students and increased scrutiny of Chinese students as a vector for intelligence or espionage concerns has also been something that a lot of Chinese STEM practitioners have been paying a lot of attention to. And so this is a very interlinked sort of network of politics, ideas, and ideology that is now changing at a pretty rapid but also complicated pace. China is definitely what we would call an exporter of techno-nationalism. It has never been really shy about advocating for, the protection of certain ideological values. For example, China's been more assertive in certain perspectives related to Hong Kong and Taiwan. It's been definitely defensive, including in multilateral spaces, about the usage of certain technology and security practices in Xinjiang, in which you're not only seeing, traditional carceral structures, jails, prisons, more extensive policing, but also surveillance, facial recognition, and mapping done by big corporations like Hikvision. So we're seeing this advocacy and promotion of techno-nationalism by China. At the same time, China is also a target of techno-nationalism. This isn't always obvious because when you look at Xi Jinping, it doesn't seem very obvious that, anything gets done to him. He is perfectly capable of continuing to, go to his office and enact policies that push for China's national interests. The answer to that is that Xi Jinping is not the person hit hardest by techno-nationalism. It is, in fact, the Chinese students, Chinese tech practitioners, very rank and file people that you and I probably wouldn't think about on a day-to-day basis. But in the longer term, in aggregate, as techno-nationalism ramps up in China and the United States, what we start to see is increasing challenges that these people face. One of the things that I like to talk about regularly in looking at US-China tech relationship is pay attention to what happens in China's tech spaces domestically. Why? Because within China's domestic tech spaces, that's where the Chinese government has the most control. And that is where they typically will pilot more restrictive technology policies. The Great Firewall of China was enacted in the early 2000s and blocked out access to Twitter, Facebook, and other social media. And now in 2020, we're starting to see the fruits of those blocks. Weibo is very, very self-censored. WeChat is able to take down content very rapidly, and people who are more nationalistic are perfectly comfortable saying what they want, but people who go against the political grain are effectively silenced on Chinese media platforms. This is not something that has happened organically, but as a result of nationalistic policy. And so what happens domestically in China is something to really take take a good look at, because this is the sort of medium to long-term security interests of the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party. So I just want to next turn to looking at how corporations really factor into this. As firms are starting to gain more power, they start to become policy players in themselves. I want to sort of call attention to a recent story within China that was a really, really big deal. And that was Jack Ma getting into hot water with the Chinese government. He made a recent speech that ran afoul of China's central bank. And effectively, the government had Ant Financial, which is the big payments giant that Ma founded. They effectively stopped its public stock listing as a result of his criticism of overregulation. And so this both showcases the the ability of the government to shut down. I guess this could qualify as dissent, although Ma has certainly been a team player to the CCP in the past, but it's also showcased the type of power that corporations have in this story, and not just Chinese corporations. Within the US-China relationship, corporations typically don't behave as a passive player. They are active, they have resources, and they opt to use those resources. Wherever there are contracts, business opportunities, or policy bonuses to be gained, corporations will tend to pursue those outcomes. Sometimes in China, this runs foul of government priorities, as Ma unfortunately found out. In the United States, you're starting to see a souring relationship between our biggest tech companies, Facebook, Google, etc., as they're finding it harder and harder to get a good foothold within China's market. Facebook has famously pursued market access in China for years. This has been something that Mark Zuckerberg has very adamantly tried to do despite the ban. Once it looked like it was not going to happen, China suddenly reemerged as a security issue for Facebook and Google. Google was also at one point considering a censored search engine called Project Dragonfly that operated within China. Just as an aside, China's biggest search service, Baidu, has long caused a lot of angst within Chinese internet users because of its sometimes inaccurate capabilities. But Project Dragonfly, after staff pushback internally, was closed. I also noticed that, as this decoupling process happens, that these companies are moving towards, contracts more aligned with American interests in, providing quote unquote clean 5G networks, in pursuing tech alliances that push back against China, but also in the process, it makes them a tidy profit. And so as this tech outlook sort of grows more and more towards this decoupling process, you're starting to have governments take a look and say, what are our security concerns? We have corporations saying, okay, how do we act as good vendors to these security concerns? But it also introduces a lot of costs to the changing diplomatic and corporate relationship. One of the biggest challenges that the TikTok WeChat ban has introduced is the dearth of standardized privacy and data policy. This has, we have lacked comprehensive Data and privacy reporting measures. TikTok's algorithm is still proprietary to ByteDance and was one of the big questions that policy practitioners had in relation to TikTok's operations in the United States and elsewhere. This went unresolved within the consideration of the ban, which I think is now still in court or in some kind of limbo. But effectively, what we have in the United States is this very like whack-a-mole style policy. If a company does something that is egregiously in violation of data and privacy rights of users or other corporations, that then they start going to court. But this method can definitely get clunky, inefficient, and also allow certain companies to bypass data and privacy standards by just going through a partner organization or by sort of adhering to the national security interests of a country that may have more lax standards. Cooperation difficulties are also really exacerbating the problems of COVID. In which national competition is becoming a factor of that is really stoking misinformation in technology. You are starting to see competitive narratives from China and the United States about the handling of the pandemic and questions on, framing the vaccine development as a competition rather than a shared security issue. And finally, in the overall outlook, and this is my last remarks before I turn the floor back to everybody else, is education. STEM is a new arena for nationalism, but at the same time, STEM education has always been something of a buffer between China and the United States. It's been not necessarily apolitical, but it's also been an opportunity where the development of open source tools has been really the grounds for more open information sharing and sometimes bypassing certain standards that China set. On GitHub, there was a repository for COVID-19 stories, reporting, blog posts, etc., that were taken off once China started cracking down on people that were doing reporting or blogging against the grain. And eventually, even though these people were, sharing stories and collaborating on ways to talk about COVID outside of China, they were arrested. And so as these information channels are getting, more and more closed off, as we're starting to see misinformation and disinformation on Chinese scientists, Chinese students, sort of go unchecked in the United States, the discursive space for technology in China and the United States starts becoming far more narrow, far more nationalistic, and it's a very, very difficult path to reverse. On that cheery note, I will turn the mic back over to you, Lucy.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Ray, for this broader horizon you just gave us, and all those questions that we should definitely address together in the time that we have left, which is a bit more than half an hour. I will actually use and abuse my position as chair to throw in the first set of questions to our distinguished speakers today. And in doing so, also encourage the three of you, maybe if you want to react to each other's remarks, also as you answer my questions. And in the meantime, I also encourage our audience to send us questions in the Q&A, and then I can allocate those questions to the speakers. So I have one question for each of you, and Seema, it actually ties in with the conclusions from Roy's remarks, which is the question of university. I think it's something you've mentioned also in your presentation, how universities are coming under increased scrutiny with potentially like bans for students' travels or visas. And it does, I mean, to me, it seems that forbidding or hampering students from traveling to one place or to another is really a strong limit to international cooperation, in particular for science and innovation, because you do need like those kind of international networks to advance science. So from your perspective, like how would you have like suggestions or ideas of how we could mitigate this? Do you already see like policies or actions from the part of universities themselves to resist this trend? Or other comments you may have on this question of like university academic cooperation, which is sort of like under stress at the moment. For Andreas, you talked a lot about the ICT firms, and at some point in your presentation, you mentioned the idea, or I didn't understand if it was already in place or if it was a recommendation for a consortium of companies, of ICT companies, and companies together could also try to act in this new space and try to also resist or adjust to the techno-nationalist era. So I thought if you could please elaborate a little bit on this idea. I think that was an interesting one to not just look at what governments can do or should do, but also companies themselves and how they can act here. And for Roy, you encouraged us to watch the Chinese domestic tech space, and that's saying that's where the Chinese government has most control. And you mentioned the Great Firewall of China. So it made me think, like, if, talking also about TikTok and WeChat, do you also see that we could be going towards a Great Firewall of the United States, where you would have no Chinese like apps at all on the digital products in the US or even maybe in Europe? So is this something that you would see happening, sort of like Great Firewall of the United States, and have two completely separate internet spaces? Then maybe just a quick one to all of you, and please answer this as you see fit, because I think it's hard to ignore at the moment, but how do you see a Biden administration make any changes or have an impact in your respective areas of expertise and on the issues we're covering today? Thank you very much. So maybe I'll just go around the same order. Seema, if you want to start.
Thank you, Lucy, for those questions. On the university side, I used to be associated with the university for a long time before I joined Stimson. So I do know a little bit about what has been happening and what the reactions are. Yes, most professors and university administrators would say that these kinds of due diligence requirements that are being placed on them are not conducive to building of knowledge networks, which is the bedrock of science and technology research. But I also do know that while they are being talked about much more now, some restrictions have already been in place in the United States for a while. Universities have been required to screen students, foreign students who try to enroll in certain departments. If they move from one department to another, so this is the kind of background screening that's already been in place for a while. Mostly, it used to be for screening out students from countries of concern like Iran and some others. But it's now, of course, being expanded. Chinese students have always been part of, grad student and postdoc workforce in universities for a very long time, and they've been considered indispensable. But what the universities are now being asked to do is to think very carefully and do a lot of screening of these students, also asking them to declare in their papers what their affiliations are, for instance. And there was a case of a PLA official who had enrolled in Boston University, and she was then fined and I think sent back home because she did not declare this. So there is going to be this push and pull about the need for having foreign students, especially Chinese students, who are very diligent and and really good, especially in the STEM subjects. So universities are going to feel that pinch. But the main issue where it's going to affect is financing of projects, which is something that the Chinese companies and institutions had undertaken. I know a little bit more about the United States and a little bit on Australia. And there have been projects or programs that were set up entirely financed by the Chinese government. And there were instances where, again, there was an attempt to curb speech by students who spoke out against some of the things in China. And they were reprimanded for it, or even in one case excluded from the entire program. So those things are going to be a problem. But I don't see a way out for universities. It's just like when we've had an issue about life sciences, the culture of responsibility in life sciences is not enough. You have to actually institute measures in place to make sure that life sciences research and development is not used for weapons of mass destruction, for instance. Universities complained about it, but then they fell in line and did institute due diligence procedures. And I think that's what's going to happen here as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That's not so optimistic, but Andreas, over to you.
Thank you, Lucy. If I may add just some quick thoughts on what Seema said. I mentioned earlier this report, Meeting the China Challenge, that just came out recently and kind of looks into some of those questions when it comes to fundamental research, including how to deal with the visa, the international student visa question. I think it's interesting also when we talk to STEM researcher, right, who overall say that the benefits largely outweigh the kind of like the downsides of having international students come to the US doing this kind of research. Data shows that most people at the end try to stay here. If you go back, we'll share this information. It might be maybe a good part, but there also are maybe problematic elements. And so the question comes up how to deal with that. I think it was encouraging, at least on my side, to hear from senior researchers in those fields to say, yes, we want those students. Maybe also, I think that comes, we'll want to actually share this as a question with all of you about, we talked about decoupling, and I was curious about what you think about. There's a kind of like huge economic forces, including in the educational sector, that kind of like would run against decoupling because there's a lot of money in higher education, bringing international students to the United States, but also in other areas. Think about, the example that I briefly came up with is like Huawei, I think, spends about $11 billion a year on US products, so US components, 70 billions in total, but 11 billions only on American companies such as Intel, Qualcomm, and Micron, to give an example. So I think there seem to be also on the US side strong economic forces that would kind of counter decoupling, which I think we need to talk about, right? What does decoupling mean? And I think Rui made a really nice, explained it really nicely. But I think the question is kind of like, how does a partial decoupling look like, and how does that, how could that look like? On my question, Lucy, that you asked me, this idea about an ICT consortium for ICT buyers. I think the idea there is that if we can couple and bring together players on the industry level to look into issues and bring them together, for example, for a specific sector, and think about the automotive industry, and if they can come together and say, okay, those are the security requirements and standards that we want to address, that the best practices that need to be in place, that if we want to buy something from a manufacturer or vendor, I think that just helps to take away some of the uncertainty that currently is out there, particularly in those cases where no international standards or guidelines are available. I think this can be helpful for an industry to cut through some of those issues when risk assessment of those technologies has become very difficult and even more politicized in the current context. I think that was the idea about this ICT consortium for ICT buyers. I think in addition to that, it's important to recognize that many trade associations do work in this space. There is, the Cybersecurity Tech Accord, for example, or the Charter of Trust, that all kind of work in this space to address cybersecurity risk, which I think is beneficial. It doesn't solve the tech nationalism problem as such, but I think it's beneficial to have like an industry level conversation about important norms that are relevant, in particular to address supply chain risk and cybersecurity issues.
Okay, thank you for this. I think it's really interesting idea. Joy, do you want to also address your question?
Okay, so the question was Great Firewall of the United States. Is this possible? I do want to emphasize that China's Great Firewall, it's not necessarily a wall in and of itself, but I would characterize it as a living wall. It's not the same firewall that it was when it was, established in the 2000s, but nowadays it's standards, moderation standards, guidelines. For example, if you start a game of Genshin Impact, which is a big Chinese developed video game, you cannot name your character Xi Jinping. So like even those small sort of details start to sort of get baked into various types of products within China. So in that sense, it is a big living wall of both government issued policies, but also directives, guidance issued by in-company party cells at China's big technology companies that in effect is moderation augmented by tech, augmented by policy measures. And so at this stage, I don't think the United States is on its way to doing exactly that. However, what we do have are, market forces that give a lot of discretion to corporations. TikTok and WeChat at present, they've run into some court hurdles where judges have questioned some of the policy underpinnings of the ban. However, what corporations are subject to in the United States is this, idea of, being patriotic and profitable. So there's this pressure to adhere more closely with, providing certain types of technology. Google, for example, I think was also had internal staff protests about developing something called Maven for the U.S. Pentagon. Amazon Web Services is, a really, really big player in U.S. government vending and a bigger part of security infrastructure. And so we're probably not getting a Chinese style Great Firewall, but I would say the more pertinent question to pay attention to is how corporations and the American legislature, we're seeing a lot of scrutiny on tech standards by our House of Representatives and Senate to try to reshape what constitutes an open business tech environment. And so these trends, I think, are probably worth watching. As to the question of the Biden administration on China, DC tends to have kind of a consensus on China that China has risen and that the United States and China are going to be competing on a lot of different fronts for the foreseeable future. But whether China is a competitor that is also a peer versus an adversary that has high ideological stakes, I think that's where political parties tend to differ a little bit more. But from what we've seen from the transition team, the emphasis on reinforcing American alliances, especially in the multilateral space and in America's traditional bilateral alliances, I would say that would be the change to watch for in the transition.
Thank you for this. We are starting to get a few questions through the Q&A related to Europe, which we haven't touched upon that much so far. I mean, obviously you're all based in the US, so it's a different perspective, but I'm thinking maybe starting by the second question actually is, we have Mrs. Alice Panier, who is asking us, how likely is it that Europe will be a battleground for US-China tech competition? Is it most likely for Europe to fall on one side or the other, end up divided, or be a global bridge builder? So maybe from your different perspectives, do you have some comments on this question?
I don't want to speak for what Europe may or may not do. I am not an expert. But from what I am seeing in terms of, say, for instance, the FDI screening policies, in the similar concerns being expressed or directives being provided to universities to be cautious about foreign students, in tech companies being asked to cooperate, all of these seem to suggest that a lot of the European countries are going to be following the US lead. But there will always be a coterie of countries who would object to this because if I'm speaking crudely, they have better, they see a better deal with China, and the same. I mean, this is not going to be very different in other parts of the world as well. Chinese assistance usually comes with no strings attached compared to Western assistance, so there is this hedging, that will go on. And I don't see Europe going outright in the US camp in the extreme sense. But the trends that I see seem to suggest they would stick with they would try to reinvigorate the transatlantic partnership and be with the US rather than choose China altogether.
Yeah, I think I would agree with you. And that kind of also speaks to what you were saying in your presentation at the beginning, that we're going to start moving into sort of like, blocks is a bit of a big word, but at least two groupings of states with different interests and different relationships. I think, Andreas, you want to add something?
Add to that quickly. I think it's a fascinating topic, right? I think when we think about 5G and the Huawei case, I think this kind of battleground situation is already kind of happening. It's seems to go back and forth. Or over last year, like new initiatives came up, such as the Clean Network initiatives from US side, kind of like to push not only Europe but also other allies kind of into a more coherent alliance. And I think this will remain challenging, and I think it's unclear where where those balls overall fall. But I think, yes, I think there is move closer towards the US. At the same time, I think all of our European colleagues recall the 2013 Snowden disclosure, and I think that caused also some question about trustworthiness of US technology, something that has also within the US, even before Snowden has been discussed. What I try to do in my remarks, as you may recall, I try to say, well, it really depends on the country. It really depends on kind of like the need of a particular country to cooperate on a particular technology. So I think we need to keep that in mind, that I don't think there will be a holistic decision to go one or the other way, but we might see a conversation within particular industries, within particular technologies, what works for them in a specific context. And so I think there will be no clear answer, but I think there might be some replications of the Huawei controversy for other technologies. This might be AI, this might be cloud computing, even though I think this is largely dominated at this point, at least in Europe, by domestic or US providers. But I think it's a space that will continue to go up. But there will be I don't think there will be a clear we go for all technology to this or all technology to that provider or block. I think that is also from a technology perspective, you want to have diversity of components of suppliers from a security perspective and on an operational level.
So I think it's also, Joy, I don't know if you want to react to this question about the position that Europeans might have at some point between US or Chinese tech, because I think it also relates in some sort of like indirectly, but to what you said about how China is also an exporter of techno-nationalism. I think that also has an impact on Europe, right?
I think there's a lot of puzzles diplomatically to resolve in this. US intelligence sharing has been frustrating partners and allies for the last couple of years in being forthcoming with certain types of information related to Huawei's security risks. This is something that I think has really hampered the ability to form more cohesive strategies. As a result, we've seen countries like the UK even conduct their own independent assessments of network security and make their choices for vendors accordingly. And of course, this is something that they are free to do, but at the same time, it's I think it is very telling what this reveals about America's capacity to coordinate cybersecurity related responses. Just to follow up with Seema's comment earlier, often when China is bidding, it can certainly offer, lower prices, but another factor is often China is the only internet infrastructure bidder in certain countries. I think Mexico, this was the case, and a lot of other emerging tech markets, Nokia and Ericsson, which are Huawei's biggest competitors in offering high-speed internet infrastructure, they don't necessarily always bid. And so this is, I think, this is a problem this is a policy question that's not going to be going away anytime soon.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for answering this question. I'm looking at the Q&A, and there is another one which is actually directed to me, which relates to the impact of Brexit and COVID-19 on intra-EU technology sharing, in particular in the defense field. So actually, I might take that one, but of course, if you want to add anything, please feel free to do so. I'll be brief because I think the Brexit is kind of like a side note to that whole debate. It's not directly linked to techno-nationalism. But I'll try to address this. The key impact of Brexit for the defense sector and defense cooperation in Europe is mostly in terms of circulation of defense products. Defense is not so much integrated at the EU level right now, so Brexit only has a limited effect on this domain, but you still have to look at companies who are trans-European companies, so who do exchange products, components, spare parts within the EU, as long as the UK was part of this. So the main impact will be mostly the question of time and delays at customs or similar. The whole idea of like circulating products and components. I think you also need to look at this in a wider context, and also going back to the election of Joe Biden in the US presidency. The fact that Europeans over the past few years have been trying to intensify their cooperation was very much due to the Trump views and how Donald Trump's administration was pressuring the Europeans into raising defense spending, etc., military spending. But more broadly, you have to look at how the great power competition, what we've been talking about between the US and China, how this is going to play out, and what impact this will have on Europeans. On the one hand, you have the EU, which might start to divide a bit on how to deal with the new situation, but the UK is going to be very much isolated now. The UK chose to leave the EU, but over the past 4 years, they were relying on the Trump administration to get a trade deal. Now the relationship might be a bit different with Joe Biden in Washington. So the question is, like, to what extent Europeans will become more divided, and how the UK will be able to position itself within these new circumstances. So going back to defense trade, the question is that for UK companies, they already have more, let's say, outlook. They have, let's say, growing ties with the US. So they might still want to grow business with the US in this situation. But on the other hand, you have the Europeans intensify cooperation with new initiatives such as the European Defence Fund and PESCO, the Permanent Structured Cooperation. And it will be difficult for the UK to access this. So I think the question is really open as to how the UK is going to situate itself in this new scenario, growing, more towards the US or trying to tie in with the European initiatives, but that's going to be more difficult for them. But I'm happy to take up further questions on this by email, because I think this is a bit of a side note to the conversation we're having today. So we have 10 more minutes and one more question that has come to us in the Q&A, which I will relay to our panelists. So the question says, in the current scenario, from everywhere in the world, governments and nations are facing COVID-19. And at the same time, you have the technological developments. So how to tackle those different challenges together? I think that's the gist of the question, is like how different governments can both face, let's say, COVID-19 and the pandemic while dealing with technological competition. I think, yeah, it's a bit of a broad question. I don't know if there's one of the three of you who want to try to tackle that one on. Otherwise, I can see if I have other questions coming in.
I could take a shot at that. You know, the idea is that dealing with COVID is about something like consequence management. And this is not where the technology competition or techno-nationalism should play a part. There should be an effort to provide assistance, whether it's in the distribution of vaccines or PPE. Those things should not be part of this competition. But in a different way, there are also people saying that if the United States wants to establish or reestablish itself or its credentials as the leader of the free world, it needs to take the lead in making sure that this distribution happens, that the supply chains for PPEs and vaccines are not blocked, and to put more money in it. And I'm a votary of that, not necessarily because of U.S. position, what it does to U.S. position, but because it's the need of the hour. If you want to maintain your supply chains, you know, the sourcing of knowledge experts, you know, the scientists, as well as many other low-cost production centers are in the developing world, which are hard hit by COVID-19. So it should not be seen as something you're doing as a special favor to these countries, but actually it's an investment in your own supply chain if you want to maintain long-term, economic relations in this area. So I'm not seeing techno-nationalism impacting this too much.
Okay, Ray, do you want to react to this? I was going to say something, but
sure.
Go ahead.
While there's been a remarkable amount of cooperation between doctors, epidemiologists that are sharing data in COVID-19, it's very encouraging to see that. At the same time, I don't know if this falls under techno-nationalism, but we are starting to see certain narratives on public health that do have a certain nationalistic bent. I cannot tell you how many times I have seen articles saying East Asia is controlling or curbing COVID-19 numbers because of Confucianism. It is a very well-worn trope at this point, and one that does not fully encapsulate the policy measures in informing the general public and in upholding certain standards that South Korea, Taiwan, Southeast Asian states like Vietnam and Thailand have done to try to curb it. And this is not something that technology policy, I would say, is exempt from either, because as a result, we've seen pushback that sometimes very democratic states, they've adopted a Confucian semi-authoritarian standards to try to curb COVID-19, and it's not exactly the right way to frame it, I would say, because these simplistic structural observations it's relied more on assumptions about different countries' cultures rather than the very real and very deadly policy consequences.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's it's really that question which generally comes back in the COVID-19 discussion, which is like to what extent it's accelerating pre-existing trends, and also that's also working in this field. Now, I totally get your point about yeah, how cliches can take over political analysis, and that's quite infuriating. But Andreas, do you want to say something to this as well?
I think I just meant to add a very minor addition here, which is kind of like the importance of competition to bring technology where it is today, right? Imagine COVID-19 would have been COVID-09, right? Like 10 years ago, or say 20 years ago for that matter, and recognize kind of the importance of the technology makes, or ICT as in particular, to the resilience of society. When you think about, you know, the distribution and logistics network that are highly efficient globally, but also domestically because of new technologies, and, you know, the way we meet currently, right, that otherwise would not have been possible like 10, 20 years ago, or definitely much more cumbersome. And so I think that's for me kind of an interesting takeaway, kind of this notion of resilience and through ICT for a moment of crisis like this one here.
Thank you very much. I think we're actually reaching the end of our allocated time together, and I don't see any new questions coming for the last 2 minutes that we have. So I don't know if maybe Sima, Andreas, Dre, is there any additional thoughts you would like to share with us on this issue? Something else you'd like to add at this stage?
Just one thing, since I did not talk about the Biden administration. Yes. You know, what you're going to see is that there is a continuation of this whack-a-mole approach that Rejong was talking about. This is, in the US, it happens because there has always been a very deep divide ideologically between liberals and conservatives, predating the Trump administration. You know, the whole idea that there are actors who should be allowed to play, it's a free market, but then what about state-directed actors who have malicious intent? And this is, you know, how do you distinguish between those, you know, what are considered legitimate actors in the free market and what are state-directed and therefore somewhat illegitimate actors who have, you know, some advantages that others don't have. And this is going to play out in the Biden administration. They will have to find, they can't go too far back, you know, to the idea that engagement with liberal economies changes authoritarian governments. They can't go back into that, but they have to find a way to balance out, you know, all of the excesses of the Trump administration now. So,
thank you very much for this food for thought. I think, Andreas, did you want to add something, or you're?
I have nothing to add. I'm not here, but I had actually a quick follow-up question for Rui about. You mentioned, and I think very aptly so, about kind of the role of Western companies in China, and you know, you talked about censorship blockage as a consequence of their retreat from China. So I think my question to you is what can Western companies do today to engage with in China, or what are the options that you see that would be feasible given the current environment? And even if you would advise doing something along those lines.
Well, certainly the discursive channels have narrowed, but in terms, I heard something that was kind of interesting the other day, I think from a different talk, but the idea was that even though there's a technological decoupling, financially, the United States and China are still very, very much intertwined in terms of investments and, you know, certain technical connections, certainly, but monetary connections between China and Silicon Valley. And some of those conversations can actually start on US soil, where people, you know, can talk at least without certain law enforcement risks that they would have in China. And so because we do have a still very much within the bounds of globalization tech environment, using the channels of that environment, I think is probably the really interesting course of action that can be taken.
Thanks for this. Okay, well, I think we're gonna wrap it up here. Another big thanks. I mean, we can't have a round of applause virtually, but the heart is there for our excellent speakers. Thank you so much for your time and for all these remarks. And I hope that we will meet each other again in another setting sometime soon. Thank you very much. Have a good day.